All views expressed are those of the speakers and their organizations, as this applies to IGDS as well.
All protocols observed, and knowing who Mrs. Seebaran-Suite is and her extensive, she has a very extensive long bio of accolades and the work that she has done and the commitment that she has shown to these issues and many more. So we're really pleased to bring her up. Thank you so much.
To be here once more, ladies and gentlemen, again at the invitation of the IGDS as we celebrate the 16 days of activism. What we're talking about this morning, of course, is sexual harassment in the workplace. And there are two themes that I want to stress on, two messages that I want to bring. The first one has to do with the existence of a remedy for sexual harassment, or the limited remedy at the Equal Opportunity Commission. And the second quick theme that I want to touch on is some emerging global issues with respect to some clarity that is being achieved in this whole debate with respect to sexual harassment in the workplace. So very quickly, as we all know, there's no specific legislation in Trinidad and Tobago to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. There are countries in the region which do have legislation. We have Guyana, we have Bullies, for example. Now, what we do have, though, in Trinidad and Tobago is a couple of remedies, or none of them quite perfect. So there is a civil lawsuit for a breach of contract. It's very arcane, very difficult to bring off. One can make a complaint if one can mobilize a union against an employer in the industrial court, and there are some important cases that have gone through there, most particularly the Republic Bank case against Battle General Workers Union in the 1990s, I believe. Then there is a possibility of invoking some protections under the Occupational Health and Safety legislation, which requires that workplaces must be safe and that employers must provide a safe system of work. And then, of course, you have the complaint to the Equal Opportunity Commission, which is what I'm going to spend just a little bit talking about. And then there are some provisions under Section 30 of the Offences Against the Person Act that can be used in the criminal sense. But to quickly get to the EOC remedy, that is in the context that the Equal Opportunity Commission has a complaints mechanism which permits persons to make a complaint of sex discrimination in the area of employment. And sex discrimination includes sexual harassment. It is a well-established category of sex discrimination. So that this is in the context, the complaints mechanism that is created in the Equal Opportunity Commission does not only deal with sex or sexual harassment in employment. I just want to put it in a broader context, that what we deal with is also discrimination under several other grounds: race and ethnicity, origin, religion, marital status and disability, and also sex, which is the one that I highlighted. And these grounds of discrimination can found a complaint in certain areas of endeavor. For example, in employment, and that is the one which deals with sexual harassment; in education, in the provision of goods and services, and in the provision of accommodation. So that's just to put the remedy in the Equal Opportunity Commission in context of the other remedies that we have. Now, we also provide a remedy for victimization, so that if somebody has complained about sex discrimination and they are victimized, that in itself can be the subject of a separate complaint. Now, one of the limitations of this Equal Opportunity Commission remedy, though, is that it can only be invoked when something has already happened. So the remedy itself is not preventative in nature. And only it's a good remedy if the Equal Opportunity Commission fails to conciliate, bring about a consensual resolution to the problem. The issue can be kicked up to the Equal Opportunity Tribunal, which is a court. It can give damages, it can give injunctions, and so on. It is a full high court. So what we are saying, though, is that it's a good remedy, the EOC remedy. It can provide significant relief, but it's not sufficient. And if we did have legislation in Trinidad and Tobago, this can create a specific duty on the part of the employer to take preventative measures. and it can also provide a mechanism for monitoring how these sexual harassment policies and programs are put into place, how effective they are. So let's forget that now and talk a bit of the global issues that have been emerging in this conversation about sexual harassment in the workplace. And the first thing, and this of course touches on themes which have been repeated by all of my previous speakers, and that is, it's all about unequal power relations between the victim and the perpetrator. So that you can have the most elaborate, the most beautifully articulated policy dealing with sexual harassment in the workplace. But if the organization itself at the very highest levels is not committed or is not forced to deal with the problem of sexual harassment, those unequal power relations between the victim and the perpetrator will always conspire to prevent the victim from coming forward, from having the space to come forward, from having the resources, the bravery, the fortitude to come forward with the complaint. And if we look at all of those major organizations in which persons have been outed for sexual harassment and summarily dismissed, you will see that all of those organizations had functioning human resource departments and all had codes. It's just that many of the codes had never been invoked. So it's about the unequal power relations between the very powerful organization who probably wants to hang on to a key man or a rainmaker or money spinner against perhaps a lowly secretary, personal assistant who is on their own against the corporation. Now, the second global issue I think that has been crystallizing is that what has emerged now is something called social media justice. Social media justice. And that is what we have been seeing with the fall of the great men. You start with Bill Cosby, you go on to Roger Ailes, you move on to Bill O'Reilly, you move through Charlie Rose, you go to Harvey Weinstein, you come on to Matt Lauer, and oh my God, I can't remember what the count is right now. But do not fool yourself that these perps have fallen because their organizations suddenly developed a conscience about women's issues. It is about social media justice and the risk of reputational damage to those corporations, why those corporations have moved and moved so quickly. A prior speaker spoke about the number of hours between the complaint and the axing, and it has to do with the fear of corporations of reputational damage. I don't know to what extent that fear is beginning to be felt in Trinidad and Tobago. We shall see. However, it is very, very powerful, and it is something that we have had a touch of it in Trinidad and Tobago. For example, with the Tim Key issue, we have had a bit of very quick justice, social media justice and activist justice as a result of that reputational damage that is threatened. Now, I can make a distinction between the social media justice that is meted out in the context of a private corporation that is afraid of damage to its reputation. Basically, what it's afraid of is 50% of the population, the part of the population which really is the part of the population which does all of the spending, banding together to come out against particular goods. But we see in contrast to different kinds of organizations which are not private corporations, and we see how resistant those organizations are to dealing with sexual harassment or punishing for sexual harassment, even though the issues are wide out in the open. And I want to refer, for example, to the American Congress and to the American system where we have a president in the United States of America who is widely believed to have engaged in sexual harassment, and look where he is. We have, for example, an aspirant to a Senate seat who appears that if he is going to be elected, notwithstanding that he is widely felt to have been guilty of gender-based violence in the worst way. And we also see other congressmen who are very, very resistant simply because it is a different kind of organization which is not so susceptible to that reputational damage. Now, what is it about sexual harassment, and this is a theme that has been touched on, what is it about sexual harassment that makes women so reluctant to come forward and also makes it so dangerous for them to come forward? And it has to do with the victimization, and it has to do with the victim shaming, the one that women frequently blame themselves. Now, some of the more pernicious elements and aspects of mechanisms to deal with sexual harassment or codes are codes which provide for mandatory confidentiality, so that the woman doesn't have a choice as to whether she wants to remain confidential or not. She must keep the issue confidential, so it keeps her isolated. Similarly, with respect to codes or contracts of employment or industrial agreements which provide for arbitration provisions. So when you have an arbitration provision as being a mandatory mechanism for dealing with sexual harassment, it means that the issue is dealt with in private, and the agreement that is reached has to be kept confidential, and the money that is paid to you is going to be paid out in drips and drabs to make sure that you don't squeal and you do not, you the victim, have to keep the issue confidential. And so therefore you can find an organization and a person who can be a serial harasser, and yet still this never come to the attention of the world, where there are 7, 8, 9, 10 areas, cases which have been settled, but nobody knows about it. So I dealt with that already. Victims feel ashamed, they feel that they are to blame. That's the psychology of the victim, and then of course the complicity of enablers and onlookers. And I know that I've run out of time. I'm going to create the indulgence of the audience and the organizers for just 2 more minutes. We have been attempting to have this conversation, many arenas, not necessarily this one. Many arenas have been attempting to deal with this question of sexual harassment in the workplace without dealing with what I call the elephant in the room. In other words, we are trying to deal with a problem without looking at what is the bigger and broader picture. And that bigger and broader picture has to do with the wider context of the aggressive nature of men's sexuality. So if it is that we do not get down to discuss that, we're going to be trying to be tinkering around with solutions for sexual harassment without dealing with that major problem. And now, so what is part of the teachable moment is that so frequently men say they don't get it, they didn't get it, they didn't realize that the behavior was offensive. So we have a teachable moment where we can start having the conversation. Yes, we don't like it. Yes, it has been objectionable. Yes, I've been putting up with it for years. It's been making me uncomfortable. And a lot of men genuinely seem not to have got it before. So we have a teachable moment where we can have those training sessions where we can communicate what is uncomfortable and what is not. I won't bother with this new concept of unlawful sexual relations. That's a whole long thing. But finally, I wanted to finally speak about the absolute importance when one is creating codes, when one is creating mechanisms of observing due process. Observing due process. Because if due process is not observed in a formal complaints procedure from the beginning, the entire complaint is going to be nullified. And this is a bit of what we have been seeing in Trinidad and Tobago, where there have been allegations of a failure. And the elements of due process, there are 2 key elements of due process, and one of them is that the perp must understand carefully what it is you are accusing them of, number 1, and number 2, they must be given an opportunity to be heard. So these are the 2 key elements of due process. And if these 2 are not adhered to, no matter how guilty the perpetrator is, and no matter how victimized and harassed the victim is, then the complaint is going to come to naught. So that I dealt with all of that. So finally, the message is, we are in a teachable moment. Let us seize it. One of the things we have to do is look at legislation. And the other thing that we have to do is to let the scales drop from our eyes and understand exactly what it is we are dealing with. If we understand what we are dealing with, we can then know exactly what are the mechanisms to be put in place. Never underestimate the resistance of a power network, a male-oriented organization. Never underestimate the strength of the resistance. You have to know what you are up against in creating the mechanisms to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace.
Thank you so much for giving us those important insights on what are the mechanisms that exist, what do we have in Trinidad and Tobago, and what do we need to push for. I think that's so important. And one of the things that during 16 days of activism, we can begin to think about what are the things we want to agitate for, what do we want to push for, what do we want to push in our activism and in our actions, because as many of the speakers said today, when we are joined and we have a force of voices and we work together, I think united we can accomplish so much. So it is now time for question and answer. So each of the speakers, you have your microphone there. And so let's give the audience an opportunity to speak, to share, to ask questions of our speakers.